Hello, this is Dr. Dan Wedding, and this is DrWedding VB08, radio buttons, checkboxes, and pizza. Checkboxes are used to activate or deactivate code in a program. The state of the checkboxes are evaluated with if blocks or if statements to determine what code should be executed and what code should be ignored. A checkbox can be toggled on and off by selecting it more than one time. Also, multiple checkboxes can be selected at the same time. Just like a checkbox, a radio button is used to activate or deactivate code in a program. The states of the radio buttons are evaluated with if blocks or if statements to determine what code should be executed and what code should be ignored. Unlike a checkbox, they can't be toggled on and off by selecting the button more than one time. And only one radio button can be activated at a time. If you have different groups of radio buttons that perform different tasks, you will need to isolate them from each other. This can be done with GroupBoxes. Checkboxes can also be put inside of a GroupBox, but this does not change how they work. It is purely for aesthetics. Now I'm going to write a program to take orders for a pizza restaurant. The program will use radio buttons, checkboxes, and GroupBoxes. I have already opened up a new project named VB08. I have also designed a new form. This form has multiple radio buttons and multiple checkboxes on it. Before we start writing code, let's investigate how these work. A checkbox can be toggled on and off by selecting it multiple times. Every time I click the mouse, the state of the checkbox is going to toggle. Also, multiple checkboxes can be selected at the same time. This is not true for radio buttons. If I select a radio button and then select it again, it's not going to toggle. The only way to turn off a radio button is by turning on another radio button. In this example, I want two groups of radio buttons, one to represent the size of the pizza and one to represent the location where I'm going to eat the pizza. So if I have a medium pizza and I want to dine in, and I select dine in, it's going to turn off my medium pizza. Only one radio button can be on at a time. To rectify this, we're going to use a GroupBox. Now that the radio buttons are in their own GroupBoxes, they're isolated from each other. Now I'll be able to select one radio button from each group. I can also put the checkboxes in a GroupBox, but it doesn't change how they work. It's only for aesthetics. Now that I have the radio buttons and checkboxes in their GroupBoxes, I'm going to clean up the form. Just like all the objects in Visual Basic, if I select the object, I can go to the Properties window and change how it looks. Also on this form is a label. The label will display the price of the pizza that is being ordered. Next, there are two buttons. One button will reset the form back to its default state, and the second button will pass the order to the staff in the kitchen. The kitchen staff will see what's displayed on the text box at the bottom of the form. However, we don't want this to be displayed until an order is actually placed. So for now, we're going to set the visible property of the text box equal to false. You'll notice that the text box is still visible. It's visible in the editor, but when the program runs, it will not be visible. I have already renamed all of the objects on the form. The radio buttons start with RB followed by a descriptive name, such as RB small, RB medium, RB large. The checkboxes have been named CB followed by a descriptive name, such as CB cheese, CB sauce, CB pepperoni, and so on. Now we can start writing the program. I'm going to start with the size of the pizza to determine the base cost. I'll double-click on the small radio button and open up the code section. I have already written the comments, and I've created a global double variable called DBL cost. The global variable can be used by all of the subroutines. The subroutine that was created when I double-clicked on the radio button is radio button small, checked changed. This is not checked set, this is checked changed. This means the subroutine will be executed when the radio button is being activated and deactivated. So inside this subroutine, we have to have an if block. The if block will determine if the radio button is being turned on or being turned off. In this case, when it is being turned on, we want to add the price of a small pizza. This if statement is looking at the checked property of the radio button. If it is true, then the price of a small pizza is added to the cost. It should be noted that the checked property is a Boolean, and therefore the equals true is actually not needed. However, for introductory programmers, I like to keep a consistent format when writing my if statements, so I'll use the equals true in this program. And if the radio button is selected, the cost will have $6.50 added to it as the base cost of a small pizza. After the value has been updated, it will be printed to the screen using format currency. The same format that was used for the small pizza was also used for the medium pizza and the large pizza. Let's see what happens when the program runs. When a small pizza is selected, $6.50 is added to the cost. If I then select a medium pizza, the price is added. I have the price of a small pizza and the price of a medium pizza. The cost is wrong because I never removed the small pizza from the cost. So I'm going to have to fix that error. Because this subroutine is executed when the radio button is checked or unchecked, we can add a second if statement to the if blocks. The second if statement will remove the price of the pizza if the radio button is turned off. Now let's see how the program runs. If I select a pizza and it's $6.50, and then select a medium pizza, it will remove the $6.50 and add in $7.25 instead. Therefore, I can only be charged for one pizza at a time. It's very important to understand that when radio buttons are being turned on and being turned off, two subroutines are being executed. For example, if the small radio button is on and I select the medium radio button, the small radio button code is executed because it's changing from on to off. The code for the medium radio button is also executed because it's going from off to on. Therefore, when a radio button is selected, more than likely two subroutines are being executed. Now we can start writing the code for the checkboxes. The code is very similar to the radio button. The only difference is, when a checkbox is checked, it does not trigger a different checkbox. It's standalone. Only one subroutine is executed when the checkbox is checked or unchecked. Before I start writing the checkbox code, I'm going to minimize the radio button code to make room on the screen. I'm going to leave one of the radio button codes open so you can compare it to the checkbox code. Looking at the checkbox code, you'll notice it's identical to the radio button code. There's an if block in the subroutine. One part of the if block adds values as the checkbox is checked, and the other one removes the value if the checkbox is unchecked. At this point, I'm going to finish up all of the subroutines for all of the pizza toppings. Now that all the subroutines for the toppings have been written, let's run the program and see what happens. First, I'm going to select the size of the pizza. Next, I'm going to start adding toppings. When I add the toppings, the cost will increase. Unlike the radio buttons, more than one checkbox can be selected at a time. And when checkboxes are unchecked, the corresponding cost is removed. Currently, there is a flaw with this program. I have the ability to add toppings to a non-existent pizza. Therefore, I'm going to need a default size for the pizza. There are two ways I can do this. First, I would set the checked property of one of the pizzas to be true. Now when the program runs, the small pizza will be selected by default. However, that doesn't update the cost. The cost was never updated because the radio button never changed states. And because it never changed states, the code behind it was never executed. To fix this problem, we'll have to set the default cost to $6.50. Double-click on the form and open up the form load subroutine. Because we know that the small pizza is selected by default, our cost will have to start at $6.50 and not $0. Now when the program runs, there's a default size of small with the corresponding price. As before, we can add toppings, remove toppings, and change the size of the pizza. There's another way we could set a default size for the pizza. Let's change the checked property of small back to false and go back to form load. Inside of form load, we'll set the checked property of the small pizza to be true. This will cause the radio button to change state. This in turn will execute its subroutine and update the cost. Before I write the code behind the buttons, I want to demonstrate that there are many ways to write the same piece of code. I'm going to minimize a few of the radio buttons to make room on the screen. The first checkbox subroutine is for the mushrooms. This should look familiar. This is the way that all of the previous subroutines were written. But if you go down to pineapple, you'll notice the if statement does not have equals true. It just says checkbox pineapple.checked. This works because the checked property is a Boolean. And if statements are looking for Booleans to determine if they're going to execute or not. If checkbox pineapple.checked is true, then the if statement will execute. If it's false, it'll advance to the else if. And not false is true. Therefore, the else if will execute. If we move down to the anchovies, the same Boolean method has been used. Checkbox anchovy.checked is in the if statement. However, because it's a Boolean, there can only be two states, true and false. So if the if is not true, we could just jump to an else statement. The else statement will execute if the if is not true. Lastly, let's move to the olives subroutine. You'll see it's following the anchovy method. However, the label cost.text has been pulled out of the if statements. Because label cost.text is in all of the if statements in this if block, it can be removed from all of the if statements, combined into a single statement, and placed after the if block. If there was a command at the beginning of all of the if statements in this if block, they could also be removed and combined into a single command. However, this command would be before the if block. First, I have to open up the button subroutine that will reset the form. This subroutine will set all of the radio buttons back to their default states and all of the checkboxes back to their default states. First, I'm going to start with the size of the pizza. The default state is small. All I need to do is set the checked property for the radio button representing the small pizza to be true. If the radio button small is already checked, then this command will do nothing. Because the state of the radio button is not changing, the checked changed subroutines won't execute. However, if the medium or large pizza is currently selected, it will execute the checked changed subroutines and update the cost on the screen. Next, I will clear all of the radio buttons in the location group box. And finally, I will clear all of the checkboxes used to represent the toppings. Let's run the program and see what happens. I'll change the size of the pizza and add some toppings. I will also select carryout. When I reset the form, the cost goes back to $6.50 and the default size of the pizza goes back to small. Now we're going to write the code for the final button. This button will record the state of the pizza and deliver the information to the kitchen staff. This will be represented by the text box at the bottom of the screen. We have to open the button subroutine. First, we're going to determine if a radio button has been selected for dine-in, carry-out, or delivery. If none of these options have been chosen, we'll have to print out an error message and remind the person taking the order to select a location. The if statement verifies that a radio button has been checked for the location. If not, it will drop to the else statement and print out an error message. If no radio buttons in the location group box are selected, the else will be executed. You'll hear a beep, the background color of the group box will turn red, and the text at the top of the group box will change from location to enter a location. If one of the radio buttons is selected, the if will execute. However, we have to assume that the error was tripped once before. Therefore, we have to undo the tasks that were done in the else. So we're going to have to change the background color back to the original color and change the text back to location. If the error message wasn't tripped, these commands will do nothing. This is very similar to when we added and subtracted a value when we were adding a topping or removing a topping. The task being done in one has to be undone in the other. If you look in the if statement, you'll notice that the background color is not being changed to a color, but to a 3-value code. That's because the color we're changing the group box back to doesn't actually have a name. So we have to give it a 3-value code. You can get this code from the Properties window on the form. Now we're going to print the information on the text box that the kitchen is going to need in order to make the pizza. We'll first start out with telling the kitchen staff if this is dine-in, carry-out, or delivery. We're going to be using an if block because we only want one of the three choices to execute, and an if block will only execute the first true statement it encounters. I have put an if block inside of the if statement. This is called nesting and is completely valid. You'll also notice there's no subroutine for the radio button dine-in, carry-out, or delivery. The only time these radio buttons are evaluated is behind the button order. Now we're going to tell the kitchen staff what size the pizza is and then the toppings. The size of the pizza is also in an if block. That's because we only want one of these three choices to be executed. This second if block is using textbox.append text. That's because we don't want to erase the information that's already on the text box. Now I'm going to add the toppings. Each topping will be in its own if block, and each of these if blocks will be made up of one if statement. This is done because the toppings are independent of each other. The toppings code would not work if the toppings were all combined into a single if block. A good rule of thumb is radio buttons are combined into one if block, and each checkbox is in its own if block. The code to handle the toppings has been added, as well as a single line of code to make the order text box visible on the screen. Let's run the program and see what happens. At this point, the program will allow us to customize our pizza. So I can get a large, extra sauce, pepperoni and mushroom for carryout. And I can place my order, and the kitchen staff will know that this is a carryout order, that the box needs to be put at the carryout window, and it's a large with extra sauce, pepperoni, and mushroom. I can reset the form and make a second order. A medium, extra sauce, anchovy, and black olive. And I'll place the order. I did not select a location, and therefore I'll get an error message. But as soon as I choose a location, I can place the order and the location window will be reset. The kitchen will also receive the order. I'm also going to add one extra line on the Reset Form button. I'm going to make the order text box invisible again. At this point, I want to demonstrate one more programming point. It has more to do with the if statement than it does with the radio buttons and checkboxes. You may notice that the if blocks are taking up a lot of screen space. Personally, this doesn't bother me because it's easy to read and understand what's going on. However, you may encounter code on the internet that is using a method to compress the if statements. I want you to understand what you're seeing if you encounter this way of writing the if statement. Multiple commands can be put on the same line if they are separated by a colon. I personally find this harder to read and think it looks a little bit messy. But it is valid code, and I think I should use this example to expose you to it. The sauce if block was taking up 3 lines on the screen, but by putting a colon between the commands, all 3 lines are now only taking up 1 line on the screen. The same compression method has been used on all of the if blocks for the toppings. You can see it does take up a lot less screen space, but it also makes the code a little bit harder to read for someone who's new to programming. Using the colon to combine lines is not restricted to the if statement. It can be done with any code. You'll notice the else statement currently has 3 lines of code. And now these 3 lines of code are taking up 1 line on the screen. When the lines are compressed using the colons, we can fit the entire subroutine on the screen. Let's run the program and verify it still works. So we can make another order, a medium, ham, pineapple, extra sauce, and extra cheese for dine-in. Reset the form. Choose a large pepperoni, extra sauce, anchovy for dine-in. Reset the form. A medium, ham, pineapple, extra sauce, extra cheese, anchovies. No, I don't want anchovies. And I want it to be for delivery. In review, checkboxes can be toggled on and off by clicking on them. Multiple checkboxes can be checked at the same time. When a checkbox changes state from on to off or from off to on, the checkbox's checked change subroutine is executed. Inside of the checked change subroutine, there is usually an if block made up of 2 if statements. One of the if statements executes when the checkbox.checked property is true. The other if statement executes when the checkbox.checked property is false. When selecting one radio button, it will change from off to on. This will automatically change the radio button that is currently selected from on to off. Clicking multiple times on the same radio button will not toggle it between checked and unchecked. Only one radio button in a group can be checked at a time. When a radio button is selected, it will cause 2 radio buttons to change. Because one radio button is being checked and a different radio button is being unchecked. This means that 2 radio buttons are changing and both will execute their checked changed subroutine. Inside of the checked change subroutine, there is usually an if block made up of 2 if statements. One of the if statements executes when the radio button.checked property is true. The other if statement executes when the radio button.checked property is false. When more than one radio button needs to be selected on a form, the radio buttons can be isolated from each other using group boxes. Only one radio button on each group box can be checked at a time. Any object can be put on a group box, such as buttons, labels, checkboxes, text boxes, and so on. But this is for aesthetics and will not change how the objects behave. The if statements inside the radio button and checkbox subroutines can take on different forms, all of which are equally valid. Some common examples are shown below. If you find these videos useful, please like and subscribe. It is the only way I can continue to make these videos.